So next slide, please. Some house rules with you today. So this event is hosted by IRMA, as I said, and as you would have just heard, this event is being recorded, and the recording will be made publicly available on the IRMA website. I'm reminding you all that you're not allowed to post any unlawful, offensive, threatening, libelous, defamatory, obscene, or objectionable content today. Please do not post or send or link any hateful, degrading, criminal, sensitive imagery or content, or any material that would violate laws or advocates or promotes intolerance or hate against other people. And we also invite you and remind you to not post or send links to spam or content that would attempt to drive attention to unrelated products, services, or initiatives. Next slide, please. So why am I saying this? Right. Because today you have ways to directly contribute to the standard revision process. So this event is one of the many opportunities and communication channels that are available to contribute, including probably our preferred channel, which is a dedicated online platform where you can submit formally your comments and suggestions and remarks. You can find it online at responsiblemining.net/comments2. And for today's session, you can use either the Q&A function of Zoom. So the icon is located at the bottom of your screen. You can use it to submit any comment, suggestion, feedback, question, concern, a recommendation to IRMA on this chapter specifically, but also on the rest of the standards, the rationale, the mechanic of the standard. And I really invite you to start doing so right now if you've already read the material and the draft standard. And what's important with the Q&A function is that you can decide to submit your content in an anonymous way. So to do so, you only need to click on the send anonymously option of the function. Next slide, please. And all these reminders about legal disclaimer and what is acceptable for sharing today is also necessary because the chat function is activated and enabled today, which is not necessarily the case with webinars and in particular events organized by IRMA. But you can use the chat function today to share content with the whole audience. But please note that you cannot use the chat in an anonymous way, so your name will be attributed. But all the content that you're sharing with us today, whether with the Q&A function or through the chat, will be saved and considered by IRMA as part of the standard revision process. And again, I'm inviting you to already share reflections, concerns, suggestions as we go along. Next slide. I have a few slides about the revision process itself. For those of you who may not be familiar, so IRMA is right now revising and submitting to the world a new version of its standard for responsible mining. And we're doing this comprehensive revision of our standards to ensure that the IRMA system remains accountable to all sectors, all stakeholder groups, and to make sure it remains aligned with our mission and vision. In practice, there are 5 key elements that are important to bear in mind when it comes to the revision process and the drivers for the changes that we're proposing. First of all, it's an opportunity for IRMA to make sure the standards and the requirements remain up to date. It's also an opportunity for us to add clarity, make the standard clearer, more accessible for all stakeholders, and also for auditors to make sure the requirements are auditable and easier or clearer to audit. It's also an opportunity for us to add consistency and strengthen the consistency to align the structure and the flow of chapters that are similar across different social and environmental issues, making sure we embed good management systems, practice, and models across all the chapters. It's also an opportunity for us to fill gaps. So any gaps where either the IRMA standard has fallen behind over the course of 5 years, now with the official IRMA standard for responsible mining being 5 years old now, and also on a number of issues where it might have been too nascent or emerging 5 years ago, and now they're more established in the landscape, and it's important for us to fill those gaps. Next slide. And what's also very important in this revision of the standard is that IRMA is now integrating key phases of the mineral supply chain and value chain into one single standard. So on top of the IRMA standard for responsible mining from 2018 and the changes that we're proposing, we're also integrating and unifying into it 2 draft standards that we published in 2021 to cover exploration and development of mining projects, and the draft standard for responsible mineral processing. So after the extraction of the minerals, the mineral processing that happens, whether it's on site or at standalone mineral processing facilities, and they're all together combined into this new draft standard for responsible mining and mineral processing 2.0. This is really probably the biggest change and evolution in this IRMA standard. Next slide. Some very important points about the draft standard that we've published. This is not a final board-approved standard. This is really a draft. It's a work in progress document. The board has approved it as an invitation for all stakeholders to comment and send their suggestions on the content, reflect on the IRMA principles and approach. We have integrated in this draft a number of notes, background notes, explanatory notes at the beginning of each chapter that summarize the changes that are proposed. And we've also inserted notes, specific notes under pretty much every single requirement to again highlight the changes that we're proposing and why, whether it addresses one of these 4 drivers that I mentioned before, remaining up to date, adding consistency, adding clarity, or filling gaps. And we have also highlighted a number of key consultation questions. I'll be sharing some of them today on occupational health and safety, but you can find them throughout the draft standard. And they really set up a number of very challenging or controversial issues that we would really like to have feedback and comments on. And additionally, if you're more comfortable with an Excel version of all the chapters and requirements and consultation questions as well, this is also available online on our website. And it's very important for me to tell you that there's also a Spanish version. So the entire draft standard is also translated and available in Spanish on our website. Next slide. And so this consultation draft, I touched on it a little bit when I explained, those different drivers for the revision, but it's really been informed in particular by the experience and the knowledge we've gathered from the initial IRMA audits. You may know that IRMA has already now published 4 audit reports, so independent audit reports. They're available on our website, and we have about 10 more that will soon be available also on our website, and we have a number of other independent audits that are also ongoing right now. So we've really learned from this process in terms of auditability, clarity, consistency. And we've also reviewed other standards, their evolution, looked at evolution among society's expectations and best practice. We've used and taken into account the comments that we received on the 2 drafts for exploration and development and mineral processing that we published in 2021. So over the last 2 years, all the comments and feedback we received, this has been taken into account, as well as our ongoing stakeholder engagement activity and the work of a number of topic-specific working groups that were also set up to reflect on a number of issues. Next slide, please. So the public consultation is open now for 90 days. So it started on October the 26th and will be open until the end of January. There are many ways to participate. As we've said already, all comments will be considered equally and objectively in whatever format they come to us, whether in today's or other live consultations, and they'll be included in a public summary of all the comments that we have received as part of IRMA leading transparency by example. And I remind you again that you can inform us that your comments and suggestions are to be treated confidentially if desired. You just need to tell us. Or today, if you use the Q&A function, you can tick the option. Next slide, please. So the dedicated online platform, I've already mentioned it. You can find it online, responsiblemining.net/comments2. You can leave comments on every single chapter at the level of individual requirements. You can also share with us general comments or reflection suggestions on the structure. There's a dedicated tab at the very bottom of your screen. Next slide. And you can also use more traditional ways to contribute. So you can use our email address, comments@responsiblemining.net, our WhatsApp line, and also our physical address in the United States of America. Next slide. Right, so now that we've been through, the sort of basics and general overview of the revision process, let's dive into today's matter of focus, the chapter on occupational health and safety. So the objectives of this chapter are to identify and avoid or mitigate occupational health and safety hazards, maintain working environments that protect workers' health and working capacity, and promote workplace safety and health. The scope of application, this chapter is applicable to all exploration, mining, and mineral processing, whether at project or operational stage. And just to note here to say that, there's one sub-requirement is only relevant for underground mining operations with, very particular and specific health and safety issues. But I'll share a slide later on the more detailed applicability of the different requirements to the different phases of mining and the mineral value chain. Next slide, please. As an upfront note, and you will find more about it in the draft standard that we've published, I really wanted to take a moment to share with you an event that has been instrumental in IRMA reviewing and revising this chapter on occupational health and safety. In June last year, the International Labour Conference at its annual convention, the 110th convention, and they adopted a very important resolution to include a safe and healthy working environment as the fifth of its International Labour Organization's fundamental principles and rights at work. So there used to be four for quite some time, actually. So the right to freedom of association and to collective bargaining, the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, abolition of child labor, elimination of discrimination. So this isn't something that changes very often, but they've decided last year to add one more fundamental principle. Next slide, please. And so despite many mining companies around the world have been, committed to high occupational health and safety standards, have really promoted safety first for, a long time. And the fact that there are already strong requirements in the 2018 IRMA standard for responsible mining, it led us to really think thoroughly and reevaluate the requirements in the IRMA standard related to the rights of workers. And we actually, it's one of the chapters where we've added the greatest number of new indicators, in particular looking at a number of rights that are enshrined in this new convention or principle, such as the right to stop work when it's unsafe, the right to training, the right to report accidents, to report dangerous occurrences, etc. So this was an upfront comment, really important for, I think, everyone to understand the rationale and why we're proposing quite a substantial number of new requirements. And we'll be able to talk about it today, really, again, inviting you, if you've already have comments or questions, concerns, or suggestions, please feel free to share with us, and we'll address them and discuss them and think about it. So in practice, I'll share with you the proposed main changes for this chapter. And again, linking it back to these 4 drivers that I introduced earlier. So one element around the consistency of this chapter with regard to the other chapters and the rest of the standard, we've reorganized it to flow like other similar chapters on social and environmental responsibility. So there's, first a requirement on having a policy and a number of governance requirements, hazard identification and assessment, management plans and procedures, requirement to develop, some specific measures to protect workers, requirements around inspection, monitoring, surveillance, then response to unsafe working conditions and events, requirements around education and training, then evaluation and reporting, and data management. Next slide, please. And one thing that I am sharing and I've been sharing and will be sharing on all chapters is really back to what I said before around, embedding into the IRMA standard good standard management systems approach, and in particular around continuous improvement. This cycle that you see here, plan, do, check, act. I bet most of you will be very familiar with this. It's one of the most common articulation of how a company can operationalize continuous improvement, and you need to go through this plan, do, check, act, continuous improvement cycle. Next slide, please. We can see here how these different elements and features of the chapter map to this plan, do, check, act, continuous improvement approach. So all the planning's about setting up policies, doing the hazard identification, risk assessment, and developing some management plan. The do will link to implementing the management procedures, taking some specific measures or actions on specific risks and requirements. Also, everything that's related to education and training will be mapped to the do. The check part of the plan, do, check, act cycle, you can see here our inspection, monitoring, surveillance, performance evaluation, reporting will be there. And then corrective actions when it comes to responding to unsafe working conditions and unwanted events, and then improving the education and training programs, and ultimately feeding into the management plans and management procedures, etc., etc. And next slide, also here you see this very important transparency / open data dimension, which is very transversal, cross-cutting all chapters and principles in the IRMA standard. And here we have the requirements around reporting and data management. Next slide, please. Where this new draft is proposing to fill gaps, here we have added a new policy requirement, and the requirement for entities, so mining companies or mineral processing companies or exploration companies, to set performance targets on occupational health and safety. We're also requiring to appoint someone in senior management to be accountable for occupational health and safety. So elevating responsibility and accountability to senior management level. Next slide. We've added clarity around contractors management and managing occupational health and safety risk and impacts and good practice with contractors. And we've added more references really throughout this chapter because we received feedback, in particular during the audits that have taken place, that it was not always clear if and when there was a responsibility for an entity to apply actions to contractors and subcontractors, or whether it was only their responsibility among their own employees and staff. So we've tried to bring in more clarity between the standard, the additional guidance, the assurance manual, auditor materials, etc. Next slide, please. We've also added additional expectations related to joint health and safety committees, again, to add clarity and remain up to date. Next slide. please. We're adding clarity also by separating and actually splitting into two requirements. First, hazard identification. So characterizing the hazards from the risk assessment. So making them two requirements to be more, to be clearer and easier to audit, and also more logical from a management perspective. And we have added an annex of what we propose, a comprehensive set of hazards that need to be considered when the entity is doing this scoping. So it's Annex 3.2 -A that you can find in the draft, and I'll come back to it later on. Next slide, please. We've also expanded the list of mitigation procedures for specific situations. That's under the 3.2.3.3, including infectious diseases that were also used to be under Chapter 3.3 and is now under 3.2.3.5. Next slide, please. We've added consistency by moving the emergency response requirements from Chapter 2.5 because they used to be, or there is in the 2018 standard, one part on emergency preparedness and response that mixes together local affected communities and stakeholders and workers. And so here, we've really dedicated this Chapter 2.5 on community emergency preparedness and response. And when it comes to emergency preparedness and response for workers, it's now under 3.2.3.6. Next slide. A few more gaps that we're proposing to fill, also, really taking into account the new ILO fundamental principles. So additional procedures related to, when workers can and should actually stop work, reporting and investigations. We expanded requirements related to first aid, worker accommodations, and response to incidents and accidents. We are also proposing to add additional requirements to support worker mental health, including after accidents. You can also find here under 3.2.6.2 in the draft standard. Next slide, please. And a few more gaps that we're proposing to fill. Again, here really integrating the node propositions and reflections from the ILO. We're proposing to expand quite substantially training requirements and adding additional expectations related to review and reporting of performance. So health and safety stats and data. Next slide, please. Here, what I'm sharing with you, and I mentioned it earlier when I talked about the scope of application, we have developed and published on our website a document that summarizes for every single requirement, whether it's applicable to exploration, project development, permitting, or operating mine or mineral processing facilities. So you can find it all on our website under resources. And here I'm sharing specifically for the health and safety chapter. You see that almost all requirements can be applicable to all phases of the mineral value chain, with a number of exceptions for the stage 1 exploration, which is really desk-based initial exploration work, where there are requirements around a number of policies and initial measures, but it really starts applying from stage 2 onwards. Next slide, please. Now, what I want to share with you is a number of sort of comparison or comparative points or elements for you to better understand how we've revised and moved from the current enforced 2018 standard to this new draft. And again, inviting you from now on to share, any comments or questions or clarification that you need, or suggestions, propositions with us in the chat or the Q&A function. So in the 2018 standard, there are 23 requirements in this chapter. And in the proposed new draft, we have 39 requirements. So, I said that this is the chapter where we're proposing probably the greatest addition, but just in practice, this figure of 16 has got actually some more nuances and details, because as I said before, we're splitting the hazard identification step from the risk assessment. So we make two requirements where there was only one before. We've expanded requirements to inform, to require clear procedures, to require training. So again, these are not brand new elements, but they're expansion with a number of new sub-requirements or details. We've also expanded the requirements to provide first aid. So in the 2018 standard, there is a requirement for workers to have access to first aid, but in practice, there was a number of gaps here where we require now instructions need to be shared, training needs to be provided, and very importantly, the equipment and material also needs to be available and provided. And we have strengthened also general training requirements now with 3.2.7, 3.4, and 0.5. So next slide, please. You see that in practice, really, there are 6 brand new elements. These are really the gaps that we're proposing to fill, and that you can, probably, really focus on or look at if you're interested in maybe the most substantial changes. So there's this requirement for a policy to be in place, that 3.2.1.1 requirement to have a dedicated management system for contractors, occupational health and safety, with a number of issues and areas where this needs to be in place and implemented. That's 3.2.1.3. Requirements around reporting and so procedure for reporting and investigation of incidents and accidents, that's 3.2.3.8. A requirement also that, I've mentioned now a couple of times, that work has to be stopped if dangerous conditions exist, and how this is defined and how companies can be audited against this. That's under 3.2.6.1. A requirement around the annual review of performance, and a new requirement on specific occupational health and safety statistics that need to be annually reported, which was clearly a gap in the standard. This is very usual and common among norms, laws, and standards. That's 3.2.8.3. That includes things like total number of near-miss incidents, total number of accidents, injuries, lost time injuries, and fatalities. Next slide, please. What I'm highlighting here is a number of key consultation questions from the draft standard. So as I said in the beginning, we have really laid out a number of consultation questions. Of course, we're welcoming comments, suggestions, feedback on pretty much every single word and how the standard is organized, the chapters. But we've put some perhaps more challenging questions that we would really like to have your comments and feedback on. And so I've pulled out a number of key questions from this chapter that I'm going to share with you now. So if you haven't read the draft standard, you can listen and see here that it already prompts reactions or comments or feedback. So I said in a previous slide that we're proposing now an annex that lists a comprehensive set of hazards that need to be considered by entities when they do the hazard scoping and sort of initial identification. And these are organized under safety hazards, chemical, physical, ergonomic, psychosocial, in biological hazards. And really, we invite you to look at this list and this annex 3.2-A and see if there are any major potential hazards that we've missed or that you believe are not applicable to mining, to mineral processing operations, or maybe are not applicable everywhere. We need to have more nuances. And also if you suggest a different way of organizing the information. So we've used existing guidance norms and ILO tables, but again, very open to propositions and arguments for changing that and organizing it in a different way. So that's the first thing that I wanted to highlight with you today. Next slide, please. In 3.2.3.2, we are proposing a list of hazard categories that always require procedures or controls. So basically if you think, it's plan, do, check, act, sort of good and sound management practice, using the hazard identification and risk assessment that would be then used by the entity to develop, update, and make sure their procedures and systems for control and management are responding to the risk that have been identified. But here we're proposing that a number of risks, whether they've been identified as key risk or not by the entity, they require procedures or controls. So it's a way of us to say, these categories are always needs procedures in any context for any entity. So here, we have unique occupational health and safety risk to specific groups of workers. Again, when it's relevant to the operation around, pregnant women, children, HIV positive, other type of transmittable diseases. When they're identified in the risk assessment, you can't just, stop there and say, oh, this is a risk. They would require procedures or controls. Same with ground control, physical stability risks, electricity, chemicals, gases and dust, explosives, mobile equipment vehicles, machinery, pressurized systems of vessels, confined spaces, inundation and inrush of water, working at heights, and material handling. So for all of them, if they're identified, then the entity would need to develop and have a procedure and controls in place. So do you agree with this approach? Anish, did you agree with the categories that are listed? Would you suggest other types of hazards? Again, inviting you to look at 3.2.3.2. And I see that there's a comment here already coming in the chat. Yes, regarding applicability. So we'll be sharing the link right now. Thank you for asking. And so that's the second consultation question I wanted to share with you. So again, any feedback, comments, remarks, propositions would be very welcome on the approach and the content itself. Next slide, please. Here I've shared other consultation questions, and again, they are more in the draft standard itself, and you can really find them in. They're highlighted on yellow background. It's really easy to find them, but I've highlighted four that I think are very interesting and would again greatly benefit from your feedback and comments. So under requirement 3.2.3.8 in the new draft, where we requiring procedures on reporting and investigation of issues and incidents. Again, double checking with everybody and you whether this is a common requirement and a common thing for many companies, mineral processing companies, to have a procedure that is related to reporting and investigation. If you don't think this is common, do you believe this is something that'll be useful? Is it right and appropriate to make it a requirement? And then are there any elements, specific elements you would add or remove from such procedures? So you can you can see in the requirement itself that we define a number of specific elements that need to be outlined and considered by the procedure. And again, we'd love to have your feedback on that. Requirement 3.2.4.4, we're suggesting that all workers have at least basic training and first aid. So this is, so the point I mentioned before on expanding and strengthening the requirements around first aid. Two questions here. Should there also always be others on site to have a higher level of knowledge or depth of first aid training or certification? So not just workers with basic training, but for example, supervisors. That's the first question, because this is not a requirement at the moment. And also we are very much aware that, mine sites, mineral processing operations can be extremely large, complexes, very huge, employing, thousands of people and thousands more of contractors and subcontractors. So do you have a suggestion for what might be an adequate number? So if it doesn't seem reasonable and feasible to train all workers in first aid, what would there be an adequate number of on-site employees, workers that should be certified with certain level in first aid that should be on-site at all times, as it applies in certain sectors, certain countries, jurisdictions, whether at collective bargaining level or even at the law level. And then there are two more questions that I wanted to highlight on 3.2.5.2, monitoring and surveillance. Again, here we are proposing a list of factors that need to be monitored and surveilled based on the outcomes of the risk assessment. So, it should the monitoring and surveillance happen only based on what the risk assessment has identified as, critical or salient risk that needs specific monitoring, or should we also require a separate assessment to help inform the monitoring program? So basically, it's one thing to assess the risks and the risk level, and then separately from that, do a separate assessment to know whether these risks present particular, exposure level and need to be monitored specifically. And I've put here a note that, for example, the Responsible Minerals initiatives, they require documentation of temperature exposure hazards that requires some monitoring of the workplace, regardless of the risk assessment outcomes. So again, it would be very good to have your, comments on the specifics or topics of issues that should be, treated differently. And then finally, on the stats that need to be reported, where I mentioned, before, things that, seem to be very common and almost mainstream now across a number of standards and standard practice on number of incidents, near misses, fatalities, injuries. But there are any other health and safety statistics that may be relevant and of public interest that IRMA should require to be publicly reported. Again, for you to, think about, these are, meant to be just, triggers and primers. There are some more consultation questions in the draft. And next slide, please. I think with that, we can close the presentation. And I'll now turn to the questions that we've received, and my colleague Michelle, perhaps to start addressing some of them. So yes, I think we've received a very good question on the challenges regarding the implementation of these procedures. So whether I'm guessing the question is related to some of the new requirements and new procedures that have been informed by the ILO new principle. But I guess we can also reflect back on, some of the already existing requirements and perhaps what we've learned from the audits. Michelle, anything you want to add or contribute here?
Well, I think as a reminder, IRMA standards are built on existing requirements that are already out there in the world. And so the question that was asked was, what do you think will be the biggest challenges to implementing these procedures? I wasn't sure if that meant this full chapter or if that was referencing the procedures that you were talking about at the moment when you were you're reviewing the consultation questions. So if whoever asked this question, if you want to provide more detail, that would be great. I honestly would love to turn that question back to the attendees on the call and ask, what do you think would be the biggest challenges to implementing these procedures? Are there requirements that we've put in here, even though they are based on existing standards out there? Are there requirements here that seem like they would be difficult to meet? And we would welcome that input. We have learned in the first several years of implementing the initial IRMA standard that occasionally we come upon circumstances where we discover that something is difficult to implement, for instance, in a particular country because of the regulatory context there, either because something isn't available that we've presumed is available, or perhaps we haven't taken into account the full range of mining activity. Let's say, for instance, we had to make some adjustments to our interpretation of the standard to bring in lithium brine operations, which are very different than hard rock mining. So I would love to hear from this group. You know, you've logged in and selected to participate in the OHS workshop here. I'd love to know if there's anything in here that has challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think one element that also may be worth mentioning is how I think throughout the standards really there were a number of requirements on the need for companies to demonstrate that if stakeholders require information to be shared, the companies should be providing this information to stakeholders. And I think we've learned that it was, I think, both hard to audit and also from time to time maybe hard to implement and measure. And so we've turned that into sort of policies to commit to share information and public interest data with stakeholders and a number of requirements to make steps and actions to operationalize these policies. So be more proactive about the sharing of information and I think there are other requirements in particular in this chapter where we've learned despite the good intention that some requirements were not necessarily the most practical, and so we've really tried to improve that in the standard. I see that there's another question that came that says, what would you say are the top 3 to 5 most important or most impactful changes in this consultation? Again, I'm not sure this person referred to the whole draft or just the chapter. I guess I can start sharing on the whole draft. And Michelle, if you want to add, or if you want to be more specific to this chapter, I think to the standard as a whole, clearly there is this integration of not only mining activities, but also exploration work and mineral processing. This is really a big change, not necessarily in terms of the substance, and also because we've learned that with the 2 drafts that we published in 2021, there was a huge overlap between environmental, social, governance, human rights requirements. This is exactly why we've decided to integrate them together. So that's probably the most impactful change. Then we have a number of new, sort of brand new chapters that weren't included in the 2018 mining standard or didn't have a dedicated chapter. For example, gender equality and gender protections was and remain a cross-cutting issue, and you can find gender-related requirements across every principle, but we've created a dedicated gender equality and gender protections chapter. We've created a new chapter on responsible sourcing that we're still working on. And I think one also of the very impactful change that we're making here in this new draft is around waste and materials management. And here, we'll be talking about it today and tomorrow. We have more sessions on them, and again, inviting you to, register to other sessions if you're interested in. But in the 2018 standard, there is only one chapter that covers both how mining waste are handled and how the facilities where the waste is stored are managed. And now we've separated that into two to have on the one hand, waste and materials management. And here we include not only mine waste, but also all input materials, input chemicals. And on the other hand, we have a dedicated management of physical stability chapter, where here we really look at facilities, stability, maintenance, monitoring, evaluation. I think that's for the draft as a whole. And maybe the question was more around this chapter. I don't know, Michelle, if you want to share some initial reflection, also on the whole standard, if you want to.
Well, no, I think you've hit the good highlights on the whole standard. I think if I were to focus on the occupational health and safety chapter, number one, the annexes that you referred to earlier in your slides that provide the details on the type of risks that are present, I think is an incredible addition that is going to be added to this coming standard. It really goes into detail on what all those risks are. We welcome input on if we have missed anything. So please provide consultation on that. I also think that the pulling out the emergency response requirements and embedding it in this chapter separate from the community emergency response is critical. That is such a significant area of risk for miners. And I think it's important that we have focus on that. And I think the third thing that I would say is this chapter was previously arranged a bit uniquely, and we have made quite a bit of effort to look to other chapters and make sure that the occupational health and safety chapter has a lot of consistent components that you find in the other chapters. And it helps auditing, it helps the mines that are endeavoring to manage their programs and strive for continuous improvement. And I think it just ensures that we've covered the basic tenets of a good program for managing health and safety.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I think this consistency effort is also quite striking, and so while going through again and again and again through the draft standard, I mean it's quite amazing to see how the efforts that have been made. And again, we would really love to hear comments and suggestions. It's also continuous improvement, I think, exercise for us, and we know there are still areas where improvement could be made. So again, welcoming all comments and suggestions here. And I guess another question that we have heard and we can hear is around the articulation between occupational health and safety and other sort of labor-related chapters. I think in the 2018 there are like cross-references between different chapters, and so I can tell everyone that the cross-references are a sort of a work in progress exercise here in the draft, also because we're waiting to hear feedback and suggestions and making sure that we cross-reference and and explicitly link different requirements with one another when we have a more sort of clear understanding of what will be the final requirements and what your comments are. But I don't know if this is something that you wanted to talk about, Michelle, how this is also taken into account where, for example, there are requirements around hazard identification. A number of hazards, they actually are linked to air pollution or water management or maintenance of infrastructures and facilities. Is it still the case in this new draft that they're actually interconnected and some management standards and procedures can actually inform and answer questions under other chapters, that you don't need specifically brand new dedicated procedures just for this when it's actually a duplication of procedures that you have under another chapter?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think it's something that the IRMA standard does well in that it recognizes that none of these things exist in isolation. And you raised a good point, for instance, about air quality and, for instance, worker health issues. The same thing would be community health issues, right? So you just look at that one particular issue when it crosses over several chapters. It might also show up in your environmental and social impact assessment activities that, where they predict what the hazards and risks will be associated with a mining or mineral operation. I think I can speak from an auditor's perspective that our auditors appreciate the cross references that happen in the standard guidance document to help map to the other chapters that might be relevant. And oftentimes auditors spend time really thinking about, where does they go out in the field and they observe something, or they read documents, or they interview stakeholders and have an observation from those data inputs. And sometimes it belongs clearly in one place, but there are other times when it feeds your understanding of a site's performance in multiple chapters.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I agree. This is, I think, one thing that the IRMA standard does very well and is so important, I think, to also match and align with everyday good and sound management practices, so not creating siloed or artificial separations between chapters. I don't think we have more questions or comments here today. So Michelle, unless there's anything else you wanted to share, I think we can wrap up this session. And again, thank everybody for your attention today and invite you to really, take the time to dive into the draft, this chapter, any other chapters, and we really look forward to reading all your comments and feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just one more plug that it's a big standard. And if your passion is occupational health and safety, it's okay to just provide us comments on that particular chapter. You don't have to tackle the whole thing at once.
Yes, absolutely. All chapters, you can download them individually as well on the resources pages of our website. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you.